See me.
We see you now.
Good evening, Facebook friends. We are glad to see you, and we have joining us. It is 5 minutes after 7. I apologize for that, but we are going to start our evening, The Redemption of Scrooge, and we are going to start with a prayer. God of what is to come, watch over us in the immediate future as we reflect on your promises for the days ahead. Guide our discussions so that we may speak your wisdom and consider how to face the future with hope and faith. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's see if I can turn this background off, because that may help.
You're in and out.
Well, see, now you get the light. So as long as I sit right here and don't move, you can see me. That's why I was using the backgrounds. So, we begin this week with stave or chapter or chorus 5. The last of the spirits is the name of the chapter. What's that? What did you say, Richard? Okay, I can't hear you. You're frozen. So I'm going to go ahead and read.
I said all I was seeing before was your picture. It kind of keeps going back and forth.
I think that's your internet connection, because we get the same with you. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came near him, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which this spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. But for this it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded. He felt that it was tall and stately when it came beside him, and that its mysterious presence filled him with solemn dread. He knew no more, for the spirit neither spoke nor moved. "I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come," said Scrooge. The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with its hand. Okay. Silence, as this spirit will be, is uncomfortable. Can you think of the causes of silence when you encounter them in a conversation?
It is uncomfortable when you not expect it.
The silence when you're not expecting a silence? Richard,
Yes.
we have the top of your head, by the way.
Okay, you want the bottom instead?
No, we'd like the full face. Thank you.
Yeah.
What are some other causes of silence?
Not knowing what to say at the moment. Feeling that it's better to keep your mouth shut than to say something.
I didn't hear the first part of what you read. I've been losing the internet connection off and on here. I don't know why. didn't hear the
I
part
just
you
said
read.
silence is uncomfortable. So I wanted to just talk about the causes of silence.
Nothing to say.
Yeah, that's usually yours. Sometimes in a conversation, some gossip will go bad, and someone will end up being insulted in that gossip because that person is present. That's an example of when this is a cause of silence. Things suddenly go bad. Sometimes someone says something totally inappropriate, for example, and then people just quit talking. There's also a stunned silence. You're just so stunned at what was said that you have nothing to say. Sometimes silence is the result of a punishment. I'm just not going to talk to you because I'm angry or upset and I want to punish you. Sometimes there's silence in a disbelief. Somebody has said something you can't possibly agree with, so you don't know how to respond. See, there's lots of causes of silence.
We're very specific, and I had all that lumped into my reasons that were very general.
Yeah, well, I was looking for the specifics, I guess. But one of the things is, what about a silence from God?
I have to question if God's really silent, or if it's that we don't want to hear what he's going to say, more than him being silent. Because we're so self-centered and think everything should be the way we think he should say, or what he should say to us.
Matt Rawle considers sometimes God being silent, and I want you to respond to his thought here. He sometimes thinks this happens because God is really inviting us to keep talking.
That's a good listening lesson.
You know, one of the things that I had learned in seminary was that sometimes if you give people an opportunity to keep talking and you just keep asking questions, they will end up solving their own problems. And so it's kind of along that line. God is inviting us to keep talking, and he is listening so that we can solve our own problems. He also said that silence can be a part of our prayer, of just sitting in silence. I keep thinking that light above my head looks like a halo. What do you think?
It does. Almost ethereal.
I mean, has anybody just made sitting in silence a part of prayer?
I have not.
I think more when I'm sitting in silence, it's more a worship, I find, than prayer. That I'm just soaking in the presence of God.
I think it depends on what type of prayer you're into. You know, if you're in a contemplative prayer state, you're sitting there to listen and to just be.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to continue reading. You are about to show me shadows of the things that have not happened, but that will happen in the time before us? Scrooge pursued. Is that so, Spirit? The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the Spirit had inclined its head. That was the only answer he received. Although well used to ghostly companion by this time, Scrooge feared the silent shape so much that his legs trembled beneath him, and he found that he could hardly stand when he prepared to follow it. The spirit paused a moment, as observing his condition and giving him time to recover. But Scrooge was all the worse for this. It thrilled him with a vague, uncertain horror to know that behind the dusty shroud there were ghostly eyes intently fixed upon him, while he, though he stretched his own to the utmost, could see nothing but a spectral hand and one great heap of black. "Ghost of the future," he exclaimed, "I fear you more than any spectre I have seen. For as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear your company, and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me?" It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight before them. "Lead on," said Scrooge, "lead on. The night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me." "I know. Lead on, spirit." The phantom moved away as if it had come towards him. Scrooge followed in the shadow of its dress, which bore him up, he thought, and carried him along. They scarcely seemed to enter the city, for the city seemed rather to spring up about them and encompass them of its own act. But there they were, in the heart of it, on 'Change, amongst the merchants, who hurried up and down and chinked the money in their pockets and conversed in groups and looked at their watches and trifled thoughtfully with their great gold seals and so forth, as Scrooge had seen them often. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen, observing that the hand was pointed to them. Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk. "No," said a great fat man with a monstrous chain. "I don't know much about it either way. I don't only know he's dead." "When did he die?" inquired another. "Last night, I believe." "Why, what was the matter with him?" asked a third, taking a vast quantity of snuff out of a very large snuff-box. "I thought he'd never die." "God knows," said the first with a yawn. "What has he done with his money?" asked a red-faced gentleman with a pendulous excrescence on the end of his nose that shook like the gills of a turkey-cock. "I haven't heard," said the man with the large chin, yawning again. "Left it to his company, perhaps?" "He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know." This pleasantry was received with general laugh. "It's likely to be a very cheap funeral," said the same speaker, "for upon my life I don't know of anybody to go to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer?" "I don't mind going if a lunch is provided," observed the man with the excrescence on his nose, "but I must be fed if I make one." Another laughed. "Well, I am the most disinterested among you, after all," said the first speaker, "for I never wear black gloves, and I never eat lunch first. But I'll offer to go if anybody else will. When I come to think of it, I'm not at all sure that I wasn't his most particular friend, for we used to stop and speak whenever we met. Bye-bye." Speakers and listeners strolled away and mixed with other groups. Scrooge knew the men, and looked towards the spirit for an explanation. The phantom glided on into a street. Its finger pointed to two persons meeting. Scrooge listened again, thinking that the explanation might lie here. He knew these men also perfectly. They were men of business, very wealthy and of great importance. He had made a point always of standing well in their esteem in a business point of view, that is, strictly in a business point of view. "How are you?" said one. "How are you?" returned the other. "Well," said the first, "Old Scratch has got his own at last, eh?" "So I'm told," returned the second. "Cold, isn't it?" "Seasonable for Christmas time. You're not a skater, I suppose?" No, something else to think of. Good morning. Not another word. That was their meeting, their conversation, and their parting. Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the spirits should attach importance to conversations apparently so trivial, but feeling assured that they must have some hidden purpose, he set himself to consider what it was likely to be. They could scarcely be supposed to have any bearing on the death of Jacob, his old partner, for that was past, and this ghost's province was the future. Nor could he think of anyone immediately connected with himself to whom he could apply them. But nothing doubting that, to whomsoever they applied, they had some latent moral for their own improvement. He resolved to treasure up every word he heard, and everything he saw, and especially to observe the shadow of himself when it appeared, for he had an expectation that the conduct of his future self would give him the clue he missed, and would render the solution of these riddles easy. He looked about in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to his usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that poured in through the porch. It gave him little surprise, however, for he had been revolving in his mind a change of life, and thought and hoped he saw his newborn resolutions carried out in this. Quiet and dark beside him stood the phantom, with its outstretched hand. When he roused himself from his thoughtful quest, he fancied from the turn of the hand, and its situation in reference to himself, that the unseen eyes were looking at him keenly. It made him shudder, and feel very cold. They left the busy scene, and went into an obscure part of town, where Scrooge had never penetrated before, although he recognized its situation and its bad repute. So quiet and dark beside him stood the phantom, with its outstretched hand. Did you ever notice that darkness seemed to follow Jesus? He was born at night. The shepherds were told at night. The wise men were coming at night. He escaped to Egypt at night. Can you think of more?
He was captured in the garden at night.
At night. Nicodemus came to him at night. And when he was...
slept at night.
What?
He slept at night.
Thank you, that's helpful. He slept at night. It's interesting because darkness, when Jesus is the light of the world, it's almost as though we are to think about him bringing light into the darkness. Why do you think it is important for us to see our own darkness or sadness and to talk to God about our heaviness of life?
If we don't communicate with him and we're in the darkness will totally envelop us if we're not careful. And that then can lead you down the road of sin.
How do you think just pouring out your heart, like they do in the Psalms, pouring out your heart in all of the dark feelings that you're having, how do you think that helps us?
That goes back to your first question. The more you talk, the more you can resolve the issue, and the better you can feel. So it's, even though we were talking about silence, but God would be listening at that point, and the more you would talk, the better you would hopefully feel. so that you could let the light come through.
I think talking about things like that crystallize in your mind ideas and thoughts, and it brings other things into your mind that you might not have otherwise thought of. So having that conversation with God is useful in that way. I think it gives him an opportunity to speak as well and put thoughts into our minds.
Was there anything in this section that really struck you?
I'm not sure that Scrooge is quite seeing it as himself. I think he's still, huh?
Not at that point, yeah.
Yeah, and so that skepticism is there.
Yeah, it really struck me because, of course, this is never told to us in most of the movies. So this is another one of those little points that is picked up in the story that we don't pick up in the movies, that he imagined that the reason he's not at the exchange is because he's already changed his life since he's looking into the future. And so his behavior has already changed. That was one of the things that kind of struck me, that was where he was at that point coming from. What are the things that can commonly make us, and I'm not saying just the three of us, but commonly make us Christmas a heavy time for many people?
Family discord.
Yes, definitely.
Losses.
Yeah, I thought of a spouse loss. Facing the first Christmas without your spouse, who has always been there every Christmas. Kind of thing. Even when the kids didn't make it back. And lonely.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a long Christmas when you don't have the family. It isn't even like Christmas, like this year for us. We didn't have anybody here at Christmas. We didn't do anything special at Christmas in regards to that type of tradition.
Yeah, and I'm sure we weren't the only ones who had low Christmases because of COVID. And so COVID itself made Christmas heavy for many people.
Much heavier than anything that we meaning Ted and I had to go through, or our family, because we had a lot to be thankful for.
So we're entering this new part of town. The ways were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people half naked, drunken, slipshod, ugly, alleys and archways like so many cesspools disgorged their offenses of smell and dirt and life upon the straggling streets, and the whole quarter reeked with crime, with filth and misery. Far in the den of this infamous resort, there was a low-browed, beetling shop below a penthouse roof, where iron, old rags, bottles, bones, and greasy offal were brought. Upon the floor within were piled up heaps of rusty keys, nails, chains, hinges, files, scales, weights, and refuse iron of all kinds. Secrets that few would like to scrutinize were bred and hidden in mountains of unseemly rags, masses of corrupted fat and sepulchres of bones. Sitting in among the wares he dealt in by a charcoal fire made of old bricks was a gray-haired rascal, nearly 70 years of age, who had screened himself from the cold air without by a frosty curtaining of miscellaneous tatters, hung upon a line, and smoked his pipe in all the luxury of calm retirement. Scrooge and the phantom came into the presence of this man, just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. But she had scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too, and she was closely followed by a man in faded black, who was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been upon the recognition of each other. After a short period of blank astonishment, in which the old man with the pipes had joined them, they all three burst into a laugh. "Let the charwoman alone to be the first," cried she who had entered first. "Let the laundress alone to be the second, and let the undertaker's man alone to be the third. Look here, old Joe, here's a chance, if we haven't all three met here without meaning it." "You could have met in a better place," said old Joe, removing his pipe from his mouth. "Come into the parlor. You were made free of it long ago, you know, and the other two ain't strangers. Stop till I shut the door of the shop. Ah, how it shrieks! There ain't such a rusty bit of metal in the place as its own hinges, I believe, and I'm sure there's no such old bones here as mine. We're all suitable in our calling. We're well matched. Come into the parlor. Come into the parlor." The parlor was a space behind the screen of rags. The old man raked the fire together with an old stair-rod, and having trimmed his smoky lamp, for it was night, with the stem of his pipe, put it in his mouth again. While he did this, the woman who had already spoken threw her bundle on the floor and sat down in a flaunting manner on a stool, crossing her elbows on her knees and looking with a bold defiance at the other two. "What odds, then? What odds, Mrs. Dilbert?" said the woman. "Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did." "That's true indeed," said the laundress. "No man more so." "Why, then, don't stand staring as if you were afraid, woman. Who's the wiser? We're not going to pick holes in each other's coats, I suppose." "No, indeed," said Mrs. Dilbert and the man together. "We should hope not." "Very well, then," cried the woman. "That's enough. Who's the worse for the loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose." "No, indeed," said Mrs. Dilbert, laughing. "If he wanted to keep 'em after he was dead, a wretched old screw," pursued the woman, "why wasn't he more natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he'd have had somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying, gasping out his last there, alone by himself." "It's the truest word that ever was spoke," said Mrs. Dilbert. "It's a judgment on him." "I wish it was a little heavier judgment," replied the woman, "and it should have been. You may depend upon it. If I could have laid my hands on anything else. Open that bundle, old Joe, and let me know the value of it. Speak out plain. I'm not afraid to be the first, nor afraid for them to see it. We knew pretty well that we were helping ourselves before we met here, I believe. It's no sin. Open the bundle, Joe." But the gallantry of her friends would not allow of this, and the man in faded black, mounting the breach first, produced his plunder. It was not expensive. A seal or two, a pencil case, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no great value were all. They were severally examined and appraised by old Joe, who chalked the sums he was disposed to give for each upon the wall, and added them up into a total when he found there was nothing more to come. "That's your account," said Joe. "I wouldn't give another sixpence if I was to be boiled for not doing it. Who's next?" Mrs. Dilbert was next. Sheets and towels, a little wearing apparel, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her account was stated on the wall in the same manner. "I always give too much to the ladies. It's a weakness of mine, and that's the way I ruin myself," said old Joe. "That's your account. If you asked me for another penny and made it an open question, I'd repent of being so liberal and knock off half a crown." "And now undo my bundle, Joe," said the first woman. Joe went down on his knees for the greater convenience of opening it, and having unfastened a great many knots, dragged out a large and heavy roll of some dark stuff. "What do you call this?" said Joe. "Bed curtains." "Ah," returned the woman, laughing and leaning forward on her crossed arms, "bed curtains." "You don't mean to say you took 'em down, rings and all, with him lying there?" said Joe. "Yes, I do," replied the woman. "Why not?" "You were born to make your fortune," said Joe, and you'll certainly do it. I certainly shan't hold my hand when I can get anything in it by reaching it out, for the sake of such a man as he was, I promise you, Joe," returned the woman coolly. "Don't drop that oil upon the blankets now." "His blankets?" asked Joe. "Who else's do you think?" replied the woman. "He isn't likely to take cold without 'em, I dare say." "I hope he didn't die of anything catching, eh?" said old Joe, stopping in his work and looking up. "Don't you be afraid of that," returned the woman. "I ain't so fond of his company that I'd loiter about him for such things, if he did. Ah, you may look through that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it, not a threadbare place. It's the best he had, and a fine one, too. They'd have wasted it if it hadn't been for me." "What do you call wasting it?" asked old Joe. "Putting it on him to be buried in, to be sure," replied the woman with a laugh. "Somebody was fool enough to do it, but I took it off again. If calico ain't good enough for such a purpose, it isn't good enough for anything. It's quite as becoming as to the body, and he can't look uglier than he did in that one." Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror, as they sat grouped about their spoil, in the scanty light afforded by the old man's lamp. He viewed them with a detestation and disgust, which could hardly have been greater, though they had been obscene demons marking the corpse itself. "Ha ha!" laughed the same woman when old Joe, producing a flannel bag with money in it, told out their several gains upon the ground. "This is the end of it, you see. He frightened every one away from him when he was alive, to profit us when he was dead. Ha ha ha!" "Spirit!" said Scrooge, shuddering from head to toe. I see. The case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heaven! What is this?" So now, what we talked about before, that he wasn't seeing himself, now we get the first hint that he is seeing himself, or beginning to.
It's an epiphany.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to plug in my phone here. I'm afraid it's gonna...
Oh, I brought you up on my phone because I can see you better on my phone than on the screen.
And okay, well, I think if I change the background, I'm adjusting the online, and unfortunately I have the thing upside down. So pardon me, those who are watching online, while I plug in the phone to make sure it doesn't die. Okay. So now Scrooge is starting to see himself. And it reminds me of that passage in James.
Well, now we're not getting a picture on the phone.
You're right, we're not. It somehow switched. There we go. So now, reminds me of that passage in James about a man looking at his face in a mirror and then going away and forgetting what he looks like. So what are the tricks we play on ourselves when we are looking in a mirror and don't see ourselves when we should? Of course, that's kind of a tough question, since if we saw ourselves, then we'd know.
I've found of late for myself, I really don't see what I'm looking at in the mirror. It's more like I brush my teeth, I wash my face, and then I'm out of the room. And the other day it hit me that I didn't know if I had paid any attention to one part of my face. And I went, I don't even remember looking at myself. So I went back to look, just because I didn't remember even looking at myself. I think sometimes we get so involved in what we're thinking or doing that we don't really pay attention to what we are doing personally.
I've also often heard it said that the character traits that irritate us in other people are usually character traits of ourselves.
That's a harsh one. Thanks, I needed that. I am in a dark spot, and here you're telling me that?
Well, trust me, it was said to me. Meaning personally to me, not in a an abstract way.
Richard, do you look in the mirror?
Yeah, but I don't know how to respond to that question. It's an odd question. I mean, I look in the mirror when I shave.
Well, I think even going a little different take is that, when we say, and I say it a lot, you may be the only Bible somebody reads. So what is it that what I am showing in that mirror? And when am I ignoring what I might see in that mirror?
Well, Paul actually said that in one of his epistles. I don't remember which one at the moment, that we are God's letters to the world, so to speak.
Right. We're their ambassadors. Yeah. And so when you look at it from that perspective, and then think about what you said, it even makes it more of a issue to pay attention to that mirror.
Yeah, a friend of mine actually wrote a song. Of course, I haven't talked to her in 30 years, but she wrote a song, "Ye are my epistle as you walk in the land of the living, written in the hearts of men, known and read by all." Okay, we're going to move on to the next scene. And Scrooge just said, "Merciful heaven, what is this?" He recoiled in terror, for the scene had changed, and now he almost touched a bed, a bare, uncurtained bed, on which, beneath a ragged sheet, there lay a something covered up, which, though it was dumb, announced itself in awful language. The room was very dark, too dark to be observed with any accuracy, though Scrooge glanced round it in obedience to a secret impulse, anxious to know what kind of room it was. A pale light, rising in the outer air, fell straight upon the bed, and on it, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of this man. Scrooge glanced towards the phantom. Its steady hand was pointed to the head. The cover was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest raising of it, the motion of a finger upon Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face. He thought of it, felt how easy it would be to do, and longed to do it, but had no more power to withdraw the veil than to dismiss the spectre at his side. O cold, cold, rigid, dreadful death, set up thine altar here, and dress it with such horrors as thou hast at thy command, for this is thy dominion. But of the loved, revered, and honored head thou canst not turn one hair to thy dread purposes, or make one feature odious. It is not that the hand is heavy, and will fall down when released. It is not that the heart and pulse are still, but that the hand was open, generous and true, the heart brave, warm and tender, and the pulse of a man's. Strike, shadow, strike, and see his good deeds springing from the wound, to sow the world with life immortal. No voice pronounced these words in Scrooge's ear, and yet he heard them when he looked upon the bed. He thought, if this man could be raised up now, what would be his foremost thoughts? Avarice, hard dealing, gripping cares, they have brought him to a rich end, truly. He lay in the dark, empty house, with not a man, a woman, or a child to say that he was kind to me in this or that. And for the memory of one kind word I will be kind to him. A cat was tearing at the door, and there was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone. What they wanted in the room of death, and why they were so restless and disturbed, Scrooge did not dare to think. Spirit, he said, this is a fearful place. In leaving it, I shall not leave its lesson. Trust me, let us go. Still the ghost pointed with an unmoved finger to the head. I understand you, Scrooge returned, and I would do it if I could, but I have not the power. Spirit, I have not the power. Again it seemed to look upon him. If there is any person in the town who feels emotion caused by this man's death, said Scrooge, quite agonized, show that person to me, Spirit. I beseech you. Now, obviously, it is for us to understand that Scrooge is looking at himself. But he's not there yet. He's seeing a man dying alone, and he wants to see someone happy or sorrowful about the death of this man. It's interesting that our society has almost become obsessed with avoiding death. We spend a lot of time trying to look younger, keep our youth, keep alive longer. Yet it did not always be that. It was not always that way. What has changed?
Yeah, but when you read the Old Testament and you lived 600-700 years, what we live today is nothing, in comparison. But we do have this weird nature to think that we're invincible. I think that's probably more the word than anything is that you have to prove to be invincible, and we're not.
You know, one of the very meaningful things that was said at my father's death, and I mean at the death. My sister and I were both there. My other two sisters had been there earlier. And we knew he was going. And hospice was there. And Becky and I sang hymns. And then prayed and gave him permission to go on to heaven, that we would be fine without him. You know, there's a dad's protection of his girls mentality, I think, in him. And the nurse from hospice actually said that was the most beautiful send-off she had ever witnessed in all of her sitting at bedsides. And that's kind of what I thought of, was that we are fearful and try to avoid death because we are uncertain. That's why we're afraid.
And people that don't have faith, it is really, really difficult for them to be at a bedside. When I think of some of those situations through my career, and it's even, I'm thinking of this one child that was in the terminal stages of cancer, and the parents were always whispering around the child. And one night when the parents were gone, the child was standing at the window looking out at the bay and said, didn't look at us, but just said, why can't my mom and dad talk about me dying? Why can't they talk to me about that? And that was a real eye-opener as far as how we do that, not only in death, but whenever there's anything that we're uncomfortable with, we don't want to talk about because we're afraid we'll say the wrong thing, or back to the beginning again of being offensive or defensive. And that was a tough one.
Yeah. And kids seem to have an undaunting faith.
Yeah. Well, they haven't had their minds so bombarded with so much garbage yet.
So how do we avoid our own fear of death?
Think that we're going on to something better.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm afraid of dying.
That's kind of the way I feel. That's why that is a question hard to ask. It's just, it's a part of the process, and we're all working to better ourselves in our relationship with God, and whatever that is that we need to do, Looking at that dash in life.
Do you want to add anything, Richard, before we go on?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I'm afraid of death. I just remember when I was very young, living in North Dakota, I thought it must be terrible to be in the ground when it's 30 below zero.
Your pipes might freeze.
Everything freezes.
You actually keep better.
How miserable that must be. But of course, you're not aware. Great mystery. But, in one sense, there's sort of an eager anticipation to go to the other side. But of course, there's a lot of unknown about it. So, but if it was unknown, there wouldn't be the eager anticipation, I guess.
Okay, I'll go ahead and continue. The phantom spread its dark robe before him for a moment, like a wing, and withdrawing it, revealed a room by daylight, where a mother and her children were. She was expecting someone, and with anxious eagerness, for she walked up and down the room, started at every sound, looked out from the window, glanced at the clock, tried, but in vain, to work with her needle, and could hardly bear the voices of the children in their play. At length the long-expected knock was heard. She hurried to the door and met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and depressed, though he was young. There was a remarkable expression in it now, a kind of serious delight of which he felt ashamed, and which he struggled to repress. He sat down to the dinner that had been hoarding for him by the fire, and when she asked him faintly what news, which was not until after a long silence, he appeared embarrassed how to answer. "Is it good," she said, "or bad?" to help him. "Bad," he answered. "We are quite ruined?" "No, there is hope yet, Caroline." "If he relents," she said, amazed, "there is. Nothing is past hope, if such a miracle has happened." "He is past relenting," said her husband. "He is dead." She was a mild and patient creature if her face spoke truth, but she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so, with clasped hands. She prayed forgiveness the next moment and was sorry, but the first was the emotion of her heart. What the half-drunken women whom I told you of last night said to me when I tried to see him and obtain a week's delay, and what I thought was a mere excuse to avoid me, turns out to have been quite true. He was not only very ill, but dying then. To whom will our debt be transferred? I don't know, but before that time we shall be ready with the money, and even though we were not, it would be a bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor in his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline. Yes, soften it as they would, their hearts were lighter. The children's faces, hushed and clustered round to hear what they so little understood, were brighter, and it was a happier house for this man's death. The only emotion that the ghost could show him, caused by the event, was one of pleasure. That scene is frequently left out, as they have to pick and choose when making a movie. But there was a musical where a bunch of those who were in debt to Scrooge were jumping around, dancing on the coffin, singing "Thank You Very Much," which would be the equivalent of that scene. What?
That was in the musical.
Right.
Scrooge. Yeah.
In the musical Scrooge.
That wasn't in the book. The one story was in the book.
Well, yeah, the story, that would be their way of portraying that scene in the book.
Well, in portraying it that way, it shows that it wasn't just the one person that was being mistreated, but all of them. You know, that it was the whole of the community there.
Yeah, in the musical. Yeah. But I'm sure that this family was not the only one who was in debt to Scrooge, who was probably happy. Other thoughts? Okay, moving along. Let me see some tenderness connected with a death, said Scrooge, or that dark chamber spirit which we left just now will be forever present to me. The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet, and as they went along Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be seen. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated round the fire. Quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner, and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet. And he took a child, and set him in their midst. Where had Scrooge heard these words? He had not dreamed them. The boy must have read them out, as he and the spirit crossed the threshold. Why did he not go on? He is hearing scripture, obviously. That was the book the boy was reading from. He is making plain his thoughts about Tiny Tim. Peter is. And we are sitting at a real breaking point in this story because the light of dawn is about to break the darkness of night that has held Scrooge's soul for far too long. How does Christmas break the darkness, break into the darkness?
It causes us to stop for a while and reflect. I don't even know who to attribute it to, but I heard somebody describe it in the manner of, for a short period of time, we become the people we always hoped we could be.
I like that.
For one day out of the year, we become the people that we hoped we always could be.
So the next question would be, how do we carry that spirit into 365 days?
I think that's part of the message of the Christmas Carol story, is that Scrooge kept Christmas in his heart and lived it every day of the year. One of the reasons it's such a great story.
Did you about to say something, Sharon?
No, I was listening intently.
Okay, any other thoughts before I go back to finish this scene? The mother laid her work upon the table and put her hand up to her face. "The color hurts my eyes," she said. "The color? Ah, poor Tiny Tim." "They're better now again," said Cratchit's wife. "It makes them weak by candlelight, and I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home, for the world. It must be near his time." "Past it, rather," Peter answered, shutting up his book. "But I think he has walked a little slower than he used these last few evenings, Mother. They were very quiet again. At last she said, and in a steady, cheerful voice that only faltered once, I have known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed. And so have I, cried Peter, often. And so have I, exclaimed another. So had all. But he was very light to carry, she resumed, intent upon her work, and his father loved him so that it was no trouble, no trouble. And there's your father at the door. She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob in his comforter, he had need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him to it most. Then the two young Cratchits got upon his knees and laid each child a little cheek against his face, as if they said, Don't mind it, father, don't be grieved. Bob was very cheerful with them, and spoke pleasantly to all the family. He looked at the work upon the table and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said. Sunday? You went today, then, Robert? Said his wife. Yes, my dear, returned Bob. I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on Sunday. My little child, cried Bob. My little child. He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his child would have been farther apart perhaps than they were. He left the room and went upstairs into the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set close beside the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. Poor Bob sat down in it, and when he had thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the little face. He was reconciled to what had happened, and went down again quite happy. They drew about the fire and talked, the girls and mother working still. Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew, whom he had scarcely seen but once, and who, meeting him in the street that day, and seeing that he looked just a little down, you know, said Bob, inquired what had happened to distress him. On which, said Bob, for he is the pleasantest spoken gentleman you ever heard, I told him, I am heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit, he said, heartily sorry for your good wife. By the by, how he ever knew that, I don't know. Knew what, my dear? Why, that you were a good wife, replied Bob. Everybody knows that, said Peter. Very well observed, my boy, cried Bob. I hope they do. Heartily sorry, he said, for your good wife. If I can be of service to you in any way, he said, giving me his card, that's where I live. Pray come to me. Now it wasn't, cried Bob, for the sake of anything he might be able to do for us, so much as for his kind way, that this was quite delightful. It really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim and felt with us. I'm sure he's a good soul, said Mrs. Cratchit. You would be sure of it, my dear, returned Bob. If you saw and spoke to him, I shouldn't be at all surprised. Mark what I say, if he got Peter a better situation. Only hear that, Peter, said Mrs. Cratchit. And then, cried one of the girls, Peter will be keeping company with someone and setting up for himself. Get along with you, retorted Peter, grinning. It's just as likely as not, said Bob. One of these days, though, there's plenty of time for that, my dear. But however and whenever we part from one another, I am sure we shall none of us forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we? Or this first parting that there was among us. Never, father, cried they all. And I know, said Bob, I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves, and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it. No, never, father, they all cried again. I'm very happy, said little Bob. I am very happy. Mrs. Cratchit kissed him. His daughters kissed him. The 2 young Cratchits kissed him. And Peter and himself shook hands. Spirit of Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God. There's obviously a recognition of God in this child. And it was a comfort to the family. Can you think of a time when you have seen the Spirit of God in a child?
I think to a certain extent it's in all children.
Children, big and small.
In fact, when we... Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think when we become most childlike is when others can see God in us. Now, what were you going to say?
I don't know.
Sorry. See, you should have said it.
I get flight of ideas and they go in one side real quick and out faster.
You know,
It's just
Go ahead.
there's something about a child's composure that elicits the face of God that we don't see in a lot of adults because we learn to hide from so many things. And we hide often the face of God within us.
I think that children also are very open to just to hearing about God and how he works. Whereas as people get older, I think they start to realize, wait a minute, if I believe all of that stuff about God, then I've got to change the way I live. I've got to not be that kind of person. I have to be less selfish. I have to do these kinds of things. The children are very accepting of the notion of God until they get to be older and the self kind of starts to emerge and they realize that being a person of faith means that you have to not put yourself first. And children are not as self-centered in that sense, I think. They're more open and willing to be open to the very idea of God.
And it seems to me they're also, most of them are more interested in pleasing the adults around them. Because they're looking for approval, and so they're more able to not worry about what am I giving up. They're more like, what can I do to please you?
The sad part is that age up to where they change over to becoming self-centered has dropped a lot in the last few years. You know, it used to be you had until maybe high school, and now you're lucky to get through the 5th grade, which is a sad thing to see, but it's the input of all the culture around us.
Well, they have more access to the culture around us than we did growing up. We didn't have the internet and Facebook and FaceTime and so forth. Okay, I'm going to read the last section of this chapter. "Spectre," said Scrooge, "something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it, but I know not how. Tell me what man that was whom we saw lying dead." The ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed him, as before, though at a different time, he thought. Indeed, there seemed no order in these later visions, save that they were in the future, into the resorts of business men, but showed not himself. Indeed, the spirit did not stay for anything, but went straight on as to the end just now desired, until besought by Scrooge to tarry for a moment. "This court," said Scrooge, "through which we hurry now, is where my place of occupation is, and has been for a length of time. I see the house. Let me behold what I shall see in days to come." The spirit stopped. The hand was pointed elsewhere. "The house is yonder," exclaimed Scrooge. "Why do you point away?" The inexorable finger underwent no change. Scrooge hastened to the window of his office and looked in. It was an office still, but not his. The furniture was not the same, and the figure in the chair was not himself. The phantom pointed as before. He joined it once again, and wondering why and whither he had gone, accompanied it until they reached an iron gate. He paused to look round before entering. A churchyard. Here then the wretched man whose name he had now to learn lay underneath the ground. It was a worthy place, walled in by houses, overrun by grass and weeds, the growth of vegetation's death, not life, choked up with too much burying, fat with repleted appetite. A worthy place. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. He advanced towards it, trembling. The phantom was exactly as it had been, but he dreaded that he saw new meaning in its solemn shape. "Before I draw nearer to that stone which you point," said Scrooge, "answer me one question. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they shadows of things that may be only?" Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood. "Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends, to which, if persevered in, they must lead," said Scrooge. "But if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it thus with what you show me." The spirit was immovable as ever. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger read this upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. "Am I that man who lay upon the bed?" he cried upon his knees. The finger pointed from the grave to him and back again. "No, spirit, oh no, no!" The finger was still there. "Spirit," he cried, tight clutching at its robe, "hear me. I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been but for this intercourse. Why show me this if I am past all hope?" For the first time the hand appeared to shake. "Good spirit," he pursued, as down upon the ground he fell before it, "your nature intercedes for me and pities me. Assure me that I yet may change these shadows you have shown me by an altered life." The kind hand trembled. "I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me that I may sponge away the writing on this stone." In his agony he caught the spectral hand. It sought to free itself, but he was strong in his entreaty and detained. The spirit, stronger yet, repulsed him. Holding up his hands in a last prayer to save his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled into a bedpost.
Is he making a bargain there?
I don't know. I think he was making a defense.
Well, pretty much, yeah. But when he's saying, "Oh, please, I want to do this all through the year," in a way, that's kind of a bargain. Yes, it's a defense, but it's also a bargain. And don't we do that when we've had some type of an epiphany in our lives? Oh, I'm not going to do this particular thing again, and trying to stay on that path is so difficult, and we end up falling short. And I just wonder how he was thinking, that how he would maintain that flow in his life.
I guess, well, he was pleading that he had really changed, so I guess that's how I read that. When I think of a bargain, I think, if you will change the writing on this stone, then I will honor Christmas all the years. And that's not the way he said it, I guess.
Right. He didn't say it that way.
So that's what I think of as a bargain. God, if you will just do this, then I will do this. And he was just saying, I have changed. I'm not the man I was. Why are you showing me this?
We have to be reminded constantly.
Yeah, we do. You know, what's really interesting is in our lives, and these are kind of the closing comments on this chapter, in our lives, there are some things that you enjoy only once and you never go back and do them again. Such as a movie that didn't, was only so-so, and you say that, yeah, that I'm glad I watched that, but I'm not watching it again. Or a mediocre football team, and some of these things really relate to whether or not we know the ending. You know, some things can be like we enjoy watching the Christmas Carol, all the versions we have in the house every year, even though we know the ending, even though we know how it ends. And yet other movies that we know the ending, it's like, why bother to see it again? It wasn't, the whole movie wasn't enjoyable, kind of thing. So the reason I'm bringing this up is that we have a God, think of this, and he says this in the first chapter of Revelations, who was and is to come. Our God is one who was, who is, and is to come. Kind of relating to the was of the ghost of Christmas past, the is the ghost of Christmas present, and the yet to come as the ghost of the future. And so because we believe in this God, a God who was means that we were forgiven. A God who came to this earth and created our redemption, or our ability to be redeemed. That means we are forgiven. So because he was a God who was on this earth, we are forgiven. A God who is means that he is with us all the time. I will be with you to the end of the age. I am with you right now, in the here and now. So a God who is with you at all times. And a God who is to come means that God's promises can be trusted into the future. We don't fear death because we know that we will be with him. We don't really know what heaven's going to look like, and we don't really know who's going to meet us at the gates. But we know that God's promises of eternal life are real, and he can be trusted. Scripture doesn't tell us everything we want to know, but it does tell us everything we need to know to trust God. What does it mean to you that God is, was, and is to come?
You started to refer to Revelation, the phrase that came to me, the Alpha and the Omega. So no matter where we are on that continuum, he's there with us.
I think it's the whole story of the Bible.
Yep.
He was and is to come.
Well, it is closing time. So I will close in prayer. God of days yet to come, give us the courage to face the future with hope and without fear. While we cannot know what the future holds, we take comfort in the truth that the future belongs to you and that you will one day bring all things to fulfillment. Empower us as we head into the future to be witnesses of the God who was, is, and is to come. We rejoice in your undeserved but wonderful invitation to accept your grace. Help us to live in the wonder of this great gift this season and all year long. In the name of the God of past, present, and future, we pray. Amen. And we should have no problem wrapping up next week. God bless and good night.
Laila Tov.